Hello, good morning. Today our guest is Dr. Thilo Huning. And Dr. Huning, who's not yet a professor, although I like to call him professor, is an expert on the impact of geography and development. So, Thilo, why is geography important?
Well, geography for empiricists and people working on economic theory, right, is the ultimate cause of development, right? While productivity differences or income differences can be caused by a lot of things and maybe even interact with each other and shape each other, there's no argument to make that geography is not something exogenous, right? So geography is something that is given to us. And is therefore a very convenient measure of economic activity, or we can really argue that geography causes everything else: institutions, culture, state capacity differences in a lot of things, and in the end, income. Right. So that is why we are interested in geography, and then also, from a researcher's perspective, geography explains, a lot of things, from international trade to things like agglomeration economics. So if you travel around, so in the paper that we're going to talk about most today, you travel around in southwestern Germany from the city of Stuttgart, travel a bit around and end up in at the Bodensee or so. You're going to see that there are differences in the way that the villages around you are shaped, right? And the argument here is that this is something that geography did, but also in combination with other factors such as institutions, culture, maybe even random things, random historical events. So over years and years, geography in combination with other things made, has created differences in economic activity, and that's what we're interested in, right? Because this is fascinating. You can engage, a bit in airplane economics and try to understand, for example, why Britain looks different from above than the US, or different areas of US or Germany looks different in different areas, and that's what we're after here.
Great. And you have a new paper titled The Fetters of Inheritance, Equal Partition and Regional Economic Development, again with your co-author Fabian. So I'm familiar with Fabian's research, and I actually sent him an interview request at some point, and I hope he responds.
Well,
And
it's usually
this
good with
paper,
responding, yeah.
the Fetters of Inheritance, is a follow-up paper to an earlier paper, The Origins of Agricultural Inheritance Traditions.
Okay, so these are both part of the same project in a way, right? So the idea is here that some very, I think, understudied part of economic history is the role, I mean, especially for the German case, it's the role of the rural areas. So economic history, especially for pre-modern times, I mean, we're using urbanization rates as one of the main measures of development, right? So basically, the only thing that rural areas can do for economic development is let people go and have them live in cities, right, where they then can finally be productive. And we basically say that that's an underexposure of something very important that happens on the countryside, and also something that basically reduces actual understanding of how the industrial revolution worked, especially in Germany, but also in other areas of the world, maybe. It reduces that, right? So we need to look at the rural areas, right, and what happens on the rural areas. And so the origins of agriculture and heritage traditions, that's the first. That's the first of these papers from this project. That's published in the Journal of Comparative Economics. Tries to understand one particular part, of the story here, and that is basically, why do we observe different traditions when it comes to inheriting a farm, right? So how do you pass down a farm? And we see mainly internationally, two main ways of doing that. And one is the father or the owner of the farm passes it down to the oldest, or one, usually son, right? Usually the oldest. And the others, from very early childhood on, know that they're not going to get the farm. They have to find something else to do with their lives, right? And then in other settings, in other areas, you have this tradition that everyone gets an equal share of the farm, right? And you will just cut down the farm and fragment it, basically, to serve everyone and give everyone a little small piece of the farm. And that is what we are trying to understand, basically, in the origins of agricultural inheritance traditions. Why is this happening, right? And we focus on Southwest Germany precisely for the fact that there is variation there. There are, if you're looking at Baden-Württemberg, one state in Southwest Germany, we see that there is very small scale municipality variation in these agricultural inheritance traditions, and these inheritance traditions cannot be explained, this variation, with something trivial like, okay, there was a border there, historical border there, oh yes, these are the elevated places, these are the valley places. You cannot explain this with something easy, right? You need to actually look into this, run a couple of regressions, and really try to understand why is there this variation between those places that engage in primogeniture, so the oldest son would get the farm, or equal petition, where everyone would get a small share, right? So that's this paper, The Origins of Agricultural Inheritance Traditions, where we're trying to understand this in light of long history. And we have to go back actually to the Romans, the Middle Ages, and the early phase of the Industrial Revolution in Germany to understand what's going on there.
Thilo, why is soil quality important?
Well, soil quality for farming is definitely important, right? So, in these papers here, soil quality is something that basically helps you to understand the survival of a farm, right? So, if you have a decent soil quality, if you have a good soil quality, right, you can make do with smaller plots, right? So, in this paper, in this project here with this inheritance tradition, you would believe that soil quality allows you to cut down the farm to more over more generations without problem, right? If you live in an area where soil quality is like really, really bad, then you need large farms in order to get the same yield, basically, right? To harvest the exact same amount of stuff, right? And therefore, you would think that these traditions have also been in the past, being influenced by soil quality. Why? Because if you cut down and fragment the farm every generation and every generation again, right? If you have a crappy soil, at some point you're going to run into problems, right? Because you cut down, and everyone is left with a little towel of land. And if you have a bad soil quality, that's not going to work, right? So at some point in time, there should be something like conflict or change of the norms, basically saying, okay, guys, we have to accept that only the oldest or only one son can inherit.
So,
That's the argument, yes.
so did soil quality lead to greater equality?
Depending on how you want to put it, right?
Because
But
this argument is
in our
made in your
argument here,
paper.
soil quality allows you to engage in equal petition for longer. That is definitely true, right? So that's one of the outcomes we have in this Origins of Agricultural Inheritance Tradition paper, right? So if you have a norm and you start with a norm where each of your children is getting the same amount of land, then as soon as if you have great soil quality, you can do that for longer, and that more egalitarian and traditions can last longer. That's true.
Thilo, your paper is contradicting the thesis that primogeniture was crucial for development in Europe. That is
True.
often argued by academics. They say that because of primogeniture, it was easier for governments to become more stable, and people became wealthier because of primogeniture. Because when we have to share the, the estate and there are too many siblings involved, over time, the wealth dissipates. So primogeniture was a plus to perpetuate long-standing wealth. But your papers are arguing a contrary point.
Yeah, so that's the second paper we're basically doing out of this project, which is called the fetters of inheritance, right? So is it bad for an agricultural economy if everyone inherits, right? Because the old argument made, especially by British scholars, based on the experience of the British Industrial Revolution, right? They argue primogeniture is much better. Primogeniture allows a few holders of large estate to maybe even engage in, in investments out of agriculture, right? It allows very early on people to migrate because they can't expect any inheritance in land, so they are basically left to go. And that paper, published in the European Economic Review, basically finds that if you look at the very small scale variation we have in Southwest Germany, where we also have a line we can exploit to use a specific econometric framework, so a regression discontinuity design, you realize, well, not so easy. And that calls basically a bit for context, right? I mean, for the Industrial Revolution in Britain, right, there's of course a lot of explanations, right, that can explain maybe 3,000% of the variation of, Britain started first, right? And one of these explanations in the literature has always been, yes, primogeniture is great, and equal petition is a problem, right? Now, if you take a bit of the historical background in other countries, that is not so true. And why is that not so true? Well, because in Southwest Germany, what happened basically is that at some point in time, the Industrial Revolution left the cities, right? So they had relatively strict norms in the city, what they could do. They still had like guilds in power and place that would do, which. So in the end, people with money thought, okay, let's invest somewhere in the countryside where it's not like so restrictive. So where would you go? Would you go into that area where you have this one a landowner on a larger estate that he got from primogeniture and is quite busy with that big farm? Or would you go into that direction where you have like these small parcel holders that, are not quite busy with all that little land that they have? So they're very happy to help you do stuff. For example, engage in rolling a few cigars, doing a bit of textile work on the side, and so this is the side work that's very and what is part of proto industry. That is this work we observe like in the 18th and 1900s on this on the countryside, and we observe it more in the equal petition areas. And you don't need a very complicated model, but that's very neoclassical economics, that those people who are like not so busy in agriculture have free time they can basically use to engage in this proto-industrial activity. And therefore, these areas are today more industrialized. And so today, the more egalitarian places are more industrialized. And in our argument, precisely because they were poorer on average, because they didn't have that much land, and they were therefore willing to work in industry in the past. And these areas then, for scaling effects, the companies just happen to be there, stayed there, are today better off.
Thilo, I want you to explain this sentence for us. It is in the abstract of the paper, The Fettered of Inheritance.
Mm-hmm.
Did the European regions industrialize first because their institutions fostered urbanization? We argue that culture, precisely an agricultural inheritance tradition that would immobilize the rural population, was no obstacle to economic growth as commonly thought. Instead, equal partition tied excess labor to the land and fostered the establishment of a low-wage, low-skill industry there. This is the statement I would like you to explain. Instead, equal partition tied excess labor to the land and fostered the establishment of a low-wage, low-skill industry.
Mm-hmm. So imagine you inherited a little farm because you live in an equal petition area in the 1800s. So if you sell that land, if you think that's not a moral obligation for you to keep it anyway because you got it from your parents, right, or from your ancestors, so if you say that just for economic reasons, should I sell that land, right? Then land markets are not perfect, right? You will not get the actual value of your land back, right? So in the end, you might at the margin think, well, I'm not going to sell it because I'm not going to get the actual value of that land back, right? And therefore you would maybe keep it even if you were a bit less well off than in other areas, right? And so they were, the people that remained in these equal partition areas, tied down by this land, were willing to engage in proto-industrial activity, and therefore uh, form the core of what we would say today is the core of the rural industry in the southwest of Germany, definitely. So we're not trying to overthrow, right, the important contributions of explaining the industrial revolution in Britain with proto industry. We're just calling for a bit more context, and we say, well, that might be different in different areas, right? And in the southwest of Germany, with the precise sequence of events that happened to happen in the industrialization of the countryside, equal petition helped the industrialization of those areas that had that tradition.
Thilo, you also say equal partition is an institution that reduces spatial labor mobility, but counterintuitively aids economic development. What is spatial labor mobility?
Well, you wouldn't. So the argument here is that if you got the land, right, you have the land, and you cannot really sell it for a good price. You're not going to get fair price in a way, right? Because land markets are not like 100% efficient, right? So that would mean that you're basically immobilized by the land that you inherited, right? So you would have rather inherited like something else, like money or so. Then you could just move to the city, become a do an apprenticeship there, do something else, right? But given that these people were given land because of a tradition of getting a share of the land, right? They would therefore be immobilized by this land because they cannot sell it, and I mean, if they leave it behind, there's nothing there from it, right? It's just an asset that's lying there dead, right? And even renting it out is also going to be less. They're going to get less if they don't work on it themselves. That's the argument, right? And therefore, they would rather stay put. And this, in the end, is an opportunity once then these capitalists from the cities search for opportunities. Where can I find helping hands to do, for example, cigar rollings, little tasks that are textile industry related, and this is all then organized in this putting out system, right? So there would be people we call them capitalists in that paper. So people with money that would say, okay, I'm giving you a few tobacco leaves, right? You go back to your farm, you work on them, and in a week I want the rolled cigars back, and I pay you for your work, right? And that would allow these people that were immobilized in a way by their inheritance to do something on the side, and therefore use their free time that they anyway have because they have less land than the others, right? So you would expect them to be a bit more you to would have to have free time in a way, and that's exactly the argument here. So they're immobilized by that land, but if you then connect the story of the capitalization of the countryside in the 19th and 20th centuries, right, you realize, well, that could be an advantage for some time, and then through standard economics of scale or something, this could be then the reason why these regions are today richer,
Thilo,
because the primogeniture areas were definitely not industrialized.
yes, Thilo, Germany is an interesting case study. Historians contend that
Mm-hmm.
German industrialization was a rural rather than an urban phenomenon. Why, Thilo? Why was it more likely to be rural than urban?
Well, one thing you have to look back to in German history is that Germany wasn't even a country until very recently, right? So 1871, there were lots of different states that had their own little capitals that never had the attraction that, for example, London or Paris had, just because they were just a bit smaller, right? So you would have a lot more cities that were governing or palace cities, but they were not as giant and didn't have the attraction in a way, right? So this decentralized structure of the economy, led to led to a more dispersed, economic activity anyway. But then, you have to realize that also until there were lots of, wars happening, which held back Germany as well. But the market integration of Germany was definitely behind France or London, also for the fact of political disintegration, right? So only the German customs union, the German Zollverein, really, abolishes all these internal trade barriers, tries to make sure that goods can travel quite freely from Hamburg to Munich without being taxed over and over and over again at these different borders of these way over 30 states we're still looking at in the 1820s, right? And then all of a sudden the German customs unions, tries to get over this a bit. But anyway, the German industrialization is delayed, and urbanization rate maybe something that is also delayed because of this process, right? So that would mean the answer here.
Thilo, what was the putting out system? And was it more likely to be developed in era of equal partition?
Yeah, so the idea is basically here. So the putting out system is this idea that a capitalist, someone who could finance the stuff, right, would give you the ability to process a product, let's say tobacco leaves or linen, right, and then create something on your farm basically. So you would take it home, right? And you would then take the finalized product back to that person, right? And they had basically a contract which would say, okay, you need to give me back the finalized cigars, for example. I will take it at that price, but you have to deliver by that date. And that would be, of course, a bit different than these factories you would come, happening later on the countryside, or that already happened at that time in cities, right, where everyone would come to the same place and work in one building that the owner of the firm actually created, right? So everyone would work at their farm, and that's crucial for our story basically, because that explains to you why the people that were engaging in this equal petition could basically split their day into doing a bit of their agricultural chores that they had to do, but also do some manufacturing work on the side.
Thilo, so I know you're arguing that geography is seminal if we want to understand economic outcomes, but you chose West Germany, a place called Baden-Württemberg. I know that in Germany W's are pronounced like V, so I don't know if I'm getting the Baden.
No,
Yeah, I
it's
don't know
bad.
if if
So I'm
so it's
from the
actually
north, so I don't
Baden.
think, but I'm from the north, so don't quote me on that. But I would say it's Baden-Württemberg.
Okay, okay. So this place in Germany, was it successful because of institutional factors or geography? Because you do contend that it had a strong state government.
Well, in these papers, the government doesn't play like a giant role, right? So we are thinking about the. I mean, if you look at the earlier history of attempted manufacture, creation of manufacturing, right? That didn't really work out quite well, right? So there were state-created manufacturing sites that basically, during the time of mercantilism, that basically failed, right? So the argument that we're making these papers is that people basically that was an interaction between capitalists and people like farmers that were willing to work on the side, right? So the state is not like really important for this one. We have another paper where we talk a bit more about the state if you want to talk about that one.
Okay. Tilo, you also undercut another orthodox opinion, the idea that immobile property affects economic growth, known as the Oswald hypothesis, named because of Andrew Oswald, an economist. What's immobile property and what's the Oswald hypothesis?
Well, so Andrew Oswald postulated basically. So I mean, you will basically see every third day on Twitter, how weird is that the Germans have such a big problem with the housing market because nobody owns the house that they live in, everyone rents. So and Oswald was arguing, well, maybe that's not such a big problem actually, right? Because if you have a house and there's a new job opportunity coming up elsewhere, the house is a problem, right? It's not, it's not just helping you. It's just also a bit of a feather, right? So he argues basically that it could make sense in a way to see um, a more flexible way of where you live, right, as an advantage for the labor market, right? You be more flexible, right? If we're all renting and we all have like weak contracts, then we can always chase the next opportunity, right? While this is not so easy, if you have to buy a house, sell a house, face transaction costs and stuff. So that's his argument. So, and we're saying yes, this could be related to what we say, right? Because here we're realizing that this basically tied down capital that they cannot release, like this land, right? That they cannot really efficiently sell because they're going to get less out of it than what they think it's worth. That actually is good for economic activity. So again, a bit of a twist on, and yeah, so that's challenging a bit the idea of Oswald, even though I'm a big fan of the thesis anyway.
Thilo, so your paper is under the heading of the deep roots literature.
Mm-hmm.
This is actually what you're studying. So today, are these places in Germany better off? Places that practice equal partition in the past?
Yes, they are better off.
And by what data?
Sorry.
By what data? Is it because of per capita income governance?
Yeah, so
What
okay, we can
metric?
we can look at even a bit better measurement of economic activity. So when we're looking, for example, of okay, so for example, so first you want to see some intermediary outcomes, right? If my story is true, or if a story is true, you would want to see that farms in areas of primogeniture are actually larger than in areas of equal petition, right? Because other than if that's not the case, then well, maybe land markets did sort it out. And it is the case that farms in primogeniture areas are definitely larger, right, than in equal petition areas. So that is proof that this inheritance tradition does have does create a difference, right? And what we then see is that employment figures and figures of very disaggregated idea about incomes, right, is a difference in the equal petition area. And in the equal petition area, if you think about GDP per capita, we would be around 800 euros higher in areas of equal petition to the day.
So you're confirming the deep root literature. Now, earlier in the interview, you said that you did another paper on the state. So if you wish, you may go ahead and talk about that paper.
Well, so that's something that we're still, working on. That's a paper that I also have with Fabian. Actually, the paper that we've, started working on way before and our first cooperation. So that's you reap what you know. And what we're doing there is basically testing. So we were both at the conference where Omar Moaf was presenting his theory on the idea that transparency is important for taxation, right? So geography induces exogenously variation that can simplify or can make it more complicated taxation, right? So if you and they compare in their paper the state in Egypt, very good the soil quality would be in a given year, right? So if one of these Egyptian peasants had like very little Nile flood, they wouldn't have to pay that much taxes because the expectation was that their soil quality wasn't as good as other peasants who got like a lot of Nile water, right? So they had a very simple tool, but would allow every assessed taxation of the agricultural output to be expected. In comparison, Mesopotamia, and that's their second example, that was all a bit more complicated. You had these private canals, you had, you didn't have this very nicely measured Nile flood, right? And that led to some completely different taxation, that led to different state hierarchy, that leads to very decentralized systems, right? Smaller grace for the authorities, right? And in the end, a completely different political system. So we watched this presentation by Moab and said, so but Egypt and Mesopotamia, right? First, they're not like really the root of. We don't really. What can we learn from this, right?
Repeat,
And
Thilo, what
there
did you
maybe
say?
also like
Thilo,
Apple,
Egypt and
yeah,
Mesopotamia are not the root of what?
they're not like then I mean as a modern economist, right? These are interesting theoretical examples, but they're not apples and apples,
Okay.
right? So what we thought while listening to that presentation was like, okay, maybe this could be interesting to do this empirically, and then you need a lot of states that are relatively comparable, right? And we thought, okay, initial idea, we have hundreds and hundreds of states in the Holy Roman Empire, right? So this medieval until the 1900s, until the 19th century state, right? That would be consisting of hundreds and hundreds of states, and we wanted to understand if this argument and their theory is correct, that if the soil quality is more complicated than in one area than in other areas, taxation becomes more complicated, and the state should suffer from that, right? The establishment of statehood should be, find that an obstacle if soil quality is complicated. So we came up with a measure which we call caloric observability, using the caloric suitability data by Gallo and Özak. And we argue, okay, caloric observability makes a difference. And then we digitized all these state borders of these hundreds and hundreds of states in the Holy Roman Empire, and find a significant link between this caloric observability, so how complicated is the soil. So in this example, right, Egypt would be highly like much more simple than Mesopotamia, right? In our measure, you would have this as GIS measure, that would be continuous measure, and we find a significant relationship between caloric observability and outcomes of state quality for medieval states, but also for states after. And that's what that paper is about.
All
We
right. For medieval states
you read
and
what you
states
know.
like what? You said medieval
Sorry.
states. You said you found those.
So we're doing this for states until 1789,
Okay,
right? And
okay.
we run, So that's when we stop, because then it becomes messy with Napoleon and stuff.
All right. So I have a degree in history. I like history, and I also like to combine history with economics. So when I read these papers, I analyze them, do interviews, and sometimes I write on these articles for a mass audience, because most people are not going to just Google Thilo Huning and read one of those papers with figures and sophisticated words. So I disseminate it for people who are interested in economic research, but they don't have the time, or maybe they lack the ability to digest the information. But speaking to you has been a pleasure, Thilo, and I would love to speak to Fabian. I sent him an email already. All right, bye. And you
Okay,
can talk
I
to
think
Fabian for me.
that's gonna be interesting as well.
Yeah, you can put in a good
I
word.
will definitely.
All right. Bye, Thilo.
All the best. Thanks.
Okay,
Bye.
bye.